chapter 3, right? And we've talked about lots of things about the supply and demand. And of course, most important thing, you have to understand the difference between the change in quantity supplied and change in supply, right? Okay, so after talking about those things, we started talking about the market, right? And market means where the suppliers and demanders, in other words, the consumers and producers are interacting. Yeah? So we are putting supply and demand together. All right, and then last class we talked about the concept of equilibrium, right? Because we call this crossing point and equilibrium point, right? And there, the equilibrium price is determined, and also the quantity is determined, right? Okay, and then we talked about the what if the for some reason current market price was lower than the equilibrium price, right? Like here, for some reason current price is here, right? What do you see in the market? Shortage, right? Because, yeah, at this low price, quantity demanded is this much, right? Because it's so cheap, right? A lot of people can afford this thing, right? And then they also would like to buy. So many people are trying to, or they desire to buy this thing, right? So they are willing and able to purchase this many. Let's say this is the quantity demanded, right? But for suppliers or producers, price is just too low, right? So not many suppliers or producers are willing and able to produce that much, right? So the quantity supplied will be rather small, right? So we have excess demand situation, right? Quantity demanded is this much, but quantity supplied is only this much, right? So this gap is what? Shortage or excess demand, right? Make sure you understand that, right? And what was the concept of equilibrium? Huh? What was the most important concept of equilibrium? What? No further change, right? So once you achieve an equilibrium, everything will stay the same. Nothing will change, right? Well, if current price was P1, obviously we're not in equilibrium, right? Which means there will be some changes, right? In the market. What's going to change exactly? What's going to happen in the market if we have shortage? Will price change?
Yes.
Okay. How?
Consumers going to beat up the price.
Okay, yeah. So right now we have this shortage, which means there are so many people trying to buy this thing, but it is not available, right? Because only this many units are supplied, right? So yes, consumers can beat up the price, right? But also the producers, they find out that, well, there is a great demand in the market. A lot of people are trying to buy this thing, but you know, not enough is available, right? So they realize that, well, we can actually raise the price a little bit, right? Charge a little bit higher price, and still there will be quantity demanded, right? People will still buy, right? Even if you charge a little bit higher price, right? And when the price is higher, then of course quantity supplied will increase, right? So gradually, market will move this way, Okay, and that's going to eliminate the shortage eventually, right? And eventually, when the market comes to an equilibrium, it will stop, right? The change will stop, right? So yes, price will change. What about quantity? Quantity exchange will what?
Quantity supply will increase, quantity demand will decrease.
What about quantity sold in the market or quantity exchanged in the market? At this price P1, right? We know this is quantity demanded, this is quantity supply, but how many units are actually sold in the market?
Quantity supply.
Yes, right? You understand? Because this is the total quantity supplied to the market, even though quantity demanded much larger, right? Actual quantity sold will be only this much, right? Okay? So quantity exchanged or quantity sold will be here, right? That's well, and then as the price adjusts, slowly, quantity exchanged will also adjust, right? And eventually it will come to this point, right? All right. And then you should also be able to explain the opposite situation. What if the price was higher than the equilibrium price, right? Then what are you going to see? Surplus, right? Because quantity supply is greater than quantity demanded, right? So at this high price, yes, that's really good for the producer, right? So they will, they're willing and able to produce and supply so many units, right? But they will find out that some of their output will be what? What's going to happen to some of the units they have produced and supplied to the market?
Remain in stock.
Right. In other words, it's going to be unsold, right? And will be still, remain in the store, right? Well, they will, as soon as they find out, what are they going to do? They're going to reduce the quantity supplied, okay? Because obviously they have produced too many units, right? So they are going to adjust the quantity, right? And as the price comes down, as the reduce the quantity, the price will also come down, right? And slowly the surplus will be eliminated, right? So market will adjust towards the equilibrium. Okay? Okay, so having that understanding, now we can talk about the comparative static. Right? Comparative static means we assume that we are currently in equilibrium, right? Market is currently in equilibrium, but something happens and either supply or demand changes. Okay? So first thing we're going to think about is, let's say supply shifts to the right, supply curve shifts to the right. What can cause this supply change? Is it an increase in supply or decrease in supply? Increase, right? Because at the same price, holding at the same price, in the original supply curve S1, right? At the same price, say P1, right? If the supply shifts to the right, that means at the same price, quantity supplied will be larger, or quantity supplied increases, right? So we call that an increase in supply, right? what can cause an increase in supply? How about increase in price? Would that make the suppliers to increase quantity supply?
Yes.
I'm confusing you, right? Let me try again, right? What can cause an increase in supply?
Development in technology.
Okay, new technology or better technology, right? Or another factor?
Increase in the number of suppliers.
Okay, in the larger number of suppliers or producers, right? And?
Yes, raw
Huh?
materials price.
Yeah, input price, right? If the input price comes down, right? Yeah, basically, right? And there are a couple of other things that we talked about, right? But the most important thing typically are input price and technology, right? All right. So either input price came down or we have a new, better technology, right? So the supply curve shifts to the right. Yeah. Let me just spend a couple of minutes to explain that again, right? So let's say initially, let's say this is the smartphone market, right? And initially the price was $200 per unit. At that price, quantity supplied or equilibrium, whatever, the quantity was say 10 million unit, right? And then suddenly someone comes up with a better technology, right? So when the manufacturers use this technology, they could substantially reduce the production cost, right? It costs a lot less to produce the same smartphone compared to before, right? Then what can happen is, well, while producing and supplying the same number of units, right, producer can actually charge lower price, right? Instead of $200, they can now charge, let's say, whatever, let's say, $170, right? And still, they can make sufficient amount of profit because of the new technology. It costs much less to produce the output, right? So, what is the story here? While producing the same number of units to the market and supplying the same number of units to the market, now producers can charge only $170. Price can come down. Okay? And that means now we have a new relationship between prices and quantity supply. Right? If you look at the supply schedule, right? Previously, price and quantity supplied, we had this relationship between the different prices and different quantity, right? But now used to be $200 and 10 million unit, right? And that means if the it was the $170, right? It would have been less than 10 million unit, like 8 million unit, right? We're talking about supply relationship, right? But now we have $170 and 10 million unit, right? Or if they still charge $200, if they still can charge $200 a unit, right? Then they can actually supply more than 10 million units, like 12 million units, right? So at $200 initially, previously, this was the relationship, but now at $200, the larger quantity will be supplied to the market, right? So either way, you can explain it or understand it in either way, this way or this way, right? We have a new relationship or new supply curve. Right? That's what we're talking about, right? It's a change in supply or increase in supply. Okay. So, what happens to equilibrium price and quantity if supply increases? That's what we're talking about, a comparative static, okay? Starting from an equilibrium point, right? Say we have an initial price and quantity, and suddenly there was a new technology introduced, right? So supply curve shifts to the right. What's going to happen to the price and quantity in the market?
Price is going to decrease.
Mm-hmm.
Supply will increase.
Right. So because supply curve is now here, right? New equilibrium point will be right there, which means quantity will be larger. In other words, more smartphones will be sold in the market, right? And the price will be lower. Okay? And you should have this intuitive understanding, not just based on the graph, right? From the graph, it is obvious, right? If the supply curve shifts to the right, new equilibrium will be here, so quantity will be larger, price will be lower, right? But just think about it. What's happening in the market? In the market, demand did not change, right? People demand still the same number of smartphones, right? But suddenly, the total supply of smartphone is larger, right? More are available, right? Then, well, price will be lower because at the initial price here, at the initial price, what are you going to see? What's going to happen in the market? If the price didn't change, now this is the new supply curve, right? So if the price was same as before, is the market still in equilibrium? No, right? At that price, what we're going to see is quantity demanded is still here, but quantity supplied will be here, right? So what do we have? Surplus, right? In other words, equilibrium is broken. Market is not in equilibrium anymore. And whenever market is not in equilibrium, what's going to happen?
There's going to be change.
Yes, market will adjust, right? There will be some changes in the market if market is not in equilibrium, right? Okay? And as we know here, market will adjust this way, right? And eventually come to another equilibrium, okay? Because once the market adjusts to this point, there is no more surplus, right? So everything's, well, everything will be, I almost said perfect, but you know, quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded at that point, right? And that means everything will stay the same. There will be no further change, right? Okay, good. So that's what we're going to talk about here in comparative study, right? So, you know, we should, what about the other situation? Suppose supply stayed the same, but suddenly demand increased. What can cause this change? What are the factors that can change demand? Demographic? In other words, larger population, right? Huh? Consumer taste? Most important thing, consumer income, right? People have larger income, right? Then demand will increase, right? And you remember any other?
Increase in the price of substitute.
Okay, yeah, prices of related goods, right? Whether it's a substitute or complements, right? If the price of related goods change, right, then that's going to change the demand for this item, right? All right. Yeah. So here, let's say whatever. Let's say this is demand for smartphone, right? And suddenly people had more money. People made more money, right? So that caused the demand curve to shift out, right? At the initial price, at the initial equilibrium price, what do you see? If the demand shifts to the right.
There's going to be more demand, quantity demand than quantity supply.
Which is what we call what?
Shortage.
Shortage, right? Yeah. So if the demand increases, right, then the initial equilibrium price, we're going to see a shortage because obviously people demand more, right, of this product, right? So that's going to cause the market to adjust, right, towards the new equilibrium. And as you see at the new equilibrium, what's going to happen to the price and quantity? Market price will, which direction? Increase, decrease? Increase, right? As you see, the market price will be higher, right? And what about the quantity sold? Quantity exchanged in the market? Huh? We just look at the graph. I mean, increase, right? Yeah. Isn't it obvious? I mean, there was no change in supply. Supply still remains the same, right? But suddenly people demand more, right? Then price will rise, probably, right? And the quantity sold will also rise, right, in the market. Okay, so as you see here, compared to the original equilibrium to new equilibrium, if you compare this original equilibrium point to new equilibrium point, what happened to supply? Was there any change in supply?
No.
No. Supply curve didn't change, right? What about quantity supplied? It increased. Because when the demand shifted to the right, the price went up. Market price or equilibrium price went up, right? So as the price goes up, there will be a what? Movement along the curve, right? Even though there was no change in supply curve, so there was no change in supply, but there was a movement along the supply curve, right? Because price grows, right? So whenever, if the supply curve stays the same, but demand curve shifts, right? Either shifts to the right or to the left, right? There will be a movement along the supply curve, and quantity supplied will change, right? Even though supply did not change. Yeah, you should be able to tell the difference. Right? Make sure you know the difference between the two, right? Change in supply and change in quantity supply, right? What if the demand curve stay the same? Demand stay the same, but the supply curve shifts. What are you going to see in the demand? Demand curve stay the same, but supply shifts, right? What are you going to see in the quantity demanded? it's going to change, right? It's going to change. In other words, there will be movement along the demand curve, right? Because price changes. Okay? Even though there was no change in demand, because supply changed, right? Price changes, and when the price changes, there will be a movement along the demand curve. In other words, quantity demanded will change, right? So let's see. One student sent me a question. There was this problem in the my econ lab. Yeah, the college tuition, right? Over the last few years, college tuition went up, right? And usually, if the price goes up, what does the law of demand says? What does the law of demand say? If the price goes up, quantity demanded should decrease, right? So the demand curve always is downward sloping, right? When the price goes up, quantity demanded should go down, right? Quantity. Okay? But what they saw was the last few years college tuition went up significantly, right? But the application to college, right? Number of students who applied to college actually went up. So, can we conclude that the demand for college education is actually upward sloping rather than downward sloping?
We should interpret that as there's external influence.
External influence.
Right? Besides price.
Okay. Well, probably, yeah. But ultimately, right, is it possible? I mean, based on what we just analyzed here, right? Can you explain a little more clearly based on what we just explained? Think about it, right? Let's say that's 5 years, right? So 5 years ago, compared to the 5 years ago, college tuition is much higher, right? But at the same time, we saw the increase in the number of applications to college, right? A lot more students are applying for college, right? So does that mean that the demand for college education is upward sloping? The key there is last 5 years. We're not talking about the same year, right? But we're comparing this year to 5 years ago. Okay? So what could have happened here? The answer is, well, first of all, the hint is the upward sloping demand curve is highly unlikely. It is there is a theoretical possibility, right? It's called the given good, right? We talked about inferior good, right? Inferior good. Inferior good means when the income, when people have larger income, right? They buy whatever, let's say, product X, right? Usually, if it's a normal good, right? When people have more money, they buy more of this thing, whatever the thing is, right? And that's what we call normal good, right? Inferior good means when the people have larger income, they buy less of this product. Okay? So, yeah, that's the idea of inferior good. So income effect is negative. when income goes up, people buy less. Quantity demanded for this good goes down, right? What about, so if the price of X goes down, there are two effects, right? We talked about this, right? There's an income effect and substitution effect. Yeah. Income effect means, let's say you are consuming two different goods, X and Y, with your income. Right? And let's say X is food and Y is what? Movies. Okay? And with all your money, you just consume two things. You eat and watch the movies. Right? And you get all the satisfaction from food and movies, right? And let's say when the price of food comes down, right? Then there's an income effect. In other words, even though your actual income did not change, right? Because food is cheaper, right? It's like you have a little bit of larger purchasing power with the same amount of. Suppose your income is $100 every month, right? And with the $100, you purchase some food and watch some movies, right? And your income did not change, but the food price came down, right? So it costs a little less to purchase the same amount of food that you need for the month, right? Then what happens is, it's like you have a little larger actual income. That's what we call real income, right? Purchasing power, right? So if it's a normal good, income effect will say X goes up, the amount of purchase of X increases, right? Right? Okay. And then the substitution effect means, compared to Y, now X is cheaper than before. So while deriving some satisfaction from food and movies, right? Because food became cheaper than before, right? You tend to spend a little more money on food. While spending $1 on food or movie, right? You can get a little more satisfaction from food compared to before, right? So the quantity demanded or quantity consumed for food will also increase, right? If it's a normal good, right? So that's why we see inverse relationship. When the price comes down, because of the income effect and substitution effect, right? Quantity demanded will go up. Yeah? But if it's an inferior good, we have this relationship. When the income goes up, you will buy less of this product. Right? So for the inferior good, when the price comes down, you will actually buy less of this product. Right? That's an income effect for inferior good. Right? But the substitution effect will still be the same, right? Compared to Y, X now becomes even cheaper, right? So naturally you will want to buy more of X while spending the same $1, right? You can derive a little more satisfaction, right? When you spend on food rather than on movie. Giffen good Giffen is a person's name, an economist who introduced this possibility, right? given good is an extreme inferior good. In other words, among the inferior good, right? If there's something which has strong income effect, right? Which is greater than substitution effect. So income effect outweighs substitution effect, right? So overall, the quantity demanded for X will actually go down when the price goes down, right? Then we're going to have a upward sloping demand curve, right? So price of this thing, price came down, right? And actually the quantity decreases. So price and quantity change in the same direction, right? That's the case of given goods. Right? Theoretically, it is possible, and in the old days, they used an example. Used a potato 200 years ago in the United States, right? In the United States, 200 years ago, when a lot of people were immigrating from Europe, right? Like Ireland, Irish immigrants, right? And their main staple is potatoes, right? They eat a lot of potatoes, right? And so when they came to the United States, they ate a lot of potatoes. But many years later, when the economy actually improved and they started making more money, right? They consumed less potatoes, right? Well, that's an inferior good, right? But as a result, right, what they found out was when the price of potatoes went down, right, the quantity consumed actually went down. I mean, normally, if the price goes down, quantity demanded would increase, right? But for this potatoes, obviously, right, the income effect was so strong rather than compared to the substitution effect, right? So when the price of potato went down, the quantity consumed of potato was actually lower, right? That's the example they gave for given good in the economics textbook, right? And that's the only realistic and real experience, real historical example they could cite, they could find, right? In our textbook, if you read the chapter 7, they give an example, a more recent example of rice consumption in China, right? In 2013 or a few years ago, they say in a very poor region in China, price of rice went down, right? And actually, quantity demanded for rice decreased. In other words, when the rice became cheaper, these poor farmers consumed actually less rice because of this income effect, right? Understand? Can you understand that, right? In other words, when the rice, obviously they eat a lot of rice. Rice is a very important food for them, right? But when the rice price came down, suddenly they felt a little bit wealthier. It made these farmers a little bit wealthier because rice costs so much less, right? So instead of consuming rice, I guess they consumed, I don't know, chicken, maybe, right? So that income effect outweighed the substitution effect, right? So actually we saw this positive relationship between the price and quantity demanded, right? So that's the case of given good. For given good, we can say demand curve is upward sloping. But again, it is highly unlikely for most of the goods. It is extremely rare to observe actual given good example, given good case, right? Even with the inferior goods, right? Demand curve is usually downward sloping, right? All right, so going back to that question of college tuition. Tuition went up, more students applied to college. How do you explain this thing? Did you see that from my econ lab? Did you have that question? Wasn't it in the assignment? No? How did you answer that problem?
We don't have enough data. Because 5 years ago, we only have 1 point on our demand curve, while we don't know how the demand changed.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, if you don't have enough data, you should try to find the data, right, to explain what happened, right? But what is your guess? If you spend some time and collect the data, what are you going to find out? What do you expect to find out? Really? You have no idea?
Because the quantity demanded increase, price increase.
Quantity demanded increase when the price. Well, that's the question. The question is saying price went up, quantity demanded went up. How do you explain this thing? Does that mean the demand curve is upward sloping? But we know that that is highly unlikely with the college education, right? It's not a given good. College education is not a given good, right? It's not even inferior good, right? So how do you explain? Well, you're seeing the answer right there, right? What do you see there? From the original equilibrium to the new equilibrium, I told you the key is that 5 years, right? We're comparing today to 5 years ago. Okay. Well, I don't know what happened, whether income increased or population increased, whatever. Obviously, what happened in the market? Yes, demand went up, right? Demand shifted to the right, right? And as a result, we see higher price and larger quantity demanded. Okay? It's not the upward sloping demand curve that we see. Okay? So make sure you're able to understand this kind of situation, right? If you see some changes over some time period, right? Then you should be able to imagine what happened in the market. Okay? The similar situation is given here in this problem. Okay? From 2006 to 2013, the price of Blu-ray players became so low, right? From $800, it came down to $95, right? You know what Blu-ray driver player is, right? It's a DVD, kind of DVD, but one Blu-ray disc can hold about, I think, 5 times the information as the normal DVD disc. Is that right? Yeah. So it was originally very expensive. DVD disc and DVD player, right, were very expensive, but it came down significantly. Actually about 2 years ago, in the summer of 2015, during the summer break, I spent I don't know, about 60 hours to convert all my home video, you know, that I took while my children were growing, right, to the digital version, because the home video were on tape, right, cassette tape, and you know, after many years, tapes deteriorate, and many years later you can't even use the tape anymore, right? So I've been, you know, planning to do that for many years, but finally I got some time, and I spent so much time and converted it, and so basically converted analog version into digital version and put them on Blu-ray disc, right? And at that time, I think I bought this Blu-ray disc, right? Not only player, but it could write on the Blu-ray disc, right? Blu-ray, so what do you call that? Writer? Blu-ray writer, right? I think I paid about $90, right? Which was amazing, right? Because some years ago it was like almost $1,000, right? Yeah. So when you compare these 2 years, 2006 to 2013, price came down so much, but quantities sold also increased, right? So what happened here? Price came down and quantity sold increased so much. So what most likely had happened? Increase in supply. Okay? Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So here's the demand and supply. Okay. And let's say this was the initial equilibrium, price and quantity in 2006, right? And 2013, what we saw was the price was much lower, much lower. Right? And quantity was also larger, right? So we are at something like at this point, right? Okay? So what could have moved from equilibrium from here to there? Yeah, supply could shifted, right? Well, that's the answer the textbook gives, or this graph, right? But I don't think this is actually accurate. What do you think? What could have happened exactly? Well, according to this graph, there was no change in demand for Blu-ray drivers, right? I think it's highly unlikely that, you know, between 2006 and 2013, during the 7 years period, right, demand remained exactly the same.
Might have decreased.
Yeah. So more likely scenario is realistically, right? What do you think? Can anybody come here and illustrate what could have happened exactly? Let's say this was the initial supply and demand, initial price and quantity, right? For extra credit, come here and illustrate this situation, right? We saw in 2013, right? The price came down almost, what, 1/10, right? From $800 to $95, right? And quantity sold increased, right? Chance for extra credit? Okay, you want to do it? Good, okay. Are you saying demand decreased?
Yeah.
Oh,
You said demand decrease.
I
not-
said that?
I heard that.
You did? Okay. I don't know. I don't think I said that. That's what's happening in the prosecutor's office. Somebody told me that. Somebody's saying, I said that, and I said, no, I don't remember. Yeah. I don't remember saying that. Huh? Okay. All right. Give me your name. Okay. Good. You get a credit, right? Anybody? Anybody else can improve this graph? Price came down from $800 to $95. According to that graph, what? Price is almost the same, maybe slightly lower, right? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you did? Okay.
Demand need to shift more, right?
Let's give chance to another person because you got a credit anyway, right? Anybody? No. Go ahead. You've been giving all the right questions without getting any credit, so you might as well get a credit this time, you know?
I would
Alright.
see this is 800 and say this is 120.
95.
95.
Mhm.
This is the quantity at initial point, and let's say this is quantity after change,
Okay.
and this is going to be the equilibrium point, and supply. I would say demand has decreased.
Why do you think demand decreased?
Because of the improvement in technology, there might have been better ways to watch DVDs instead of Blu-ray. So
Well, first of all, if the demand actually decreased, right? Why would producers supply more? I mean, in order to produce and supply more the Blu-ray players, right? They have to invest money to build a facility, right? And it's not that simple to increase the supply, right? Sometimes it takes a few years to plan and actually, build a facility and actually produce the DVD Blu-ray players and supply to the market, right? Usually, producers increase the supply expecting that demand increases, right?
it doesn't matter if the profit increases. let's say the area for this is
I
greater.
understand, but okay, thanks. I'll give you the credit anyway, right? So this is exactly the same as this one, right? And I'm telling you that this is not really realistic, right? Because this says over the years the demand stayed the same, right? I think what probably happened realistically is demand increased, and that's what usually happens, you know. Initially, when something new is introduced, like Blu-ray drive, or even when they came up with this DVD, right? Initially, right? The demand was rather small, right? Because all the households were watching the movie on their VCR, right? Video cassette recorder, right? Or video cassette player, right? But you know, gradually people moved towards the DVD player. So the demand for DVD players increased significantly, actually, right? And because of that, the suppliers, right, got into this DVD production, DVD player, right? So a lot more companies produced and supplied DVD players. So as a result, the price came down significantly, right? Blu-ray drive, exactly the same thing, right? Initially, people don't. I mean, the DVD and Blu-ray drive, Blu-ray system were same thing almost. Same. The only difference is the amount of data one disc can hold, right? So I mean, most of the movies are 2 hours long, right? And typical DVD can hold a 2-hour movie, right? Just fine, right? But the Blu-ray can hold a lot more than 2-hour video, right? So the people like me, right, who need to keep a lot of videos, right? Use, I guess, Blu-ray, right, system, right? Anyway, so so demand increased, but the supply increased a lot more, right? So we have eventually, so from this original equilibrium, we move to this new equilibrium, right? So E0 to E1, right? So price came down significantly, let's say, and the quantity also increased, right? I think that's more realistic rather than demand going down, right? Because if the demand actually goes down, then the suppliers would not produce that many Blu-ray players and supply to the market, right? Anyway, so yeah, these are the things, and the important thing is you should be able to think through, and using the graphs, you should be able to illustrate the situation, right? And come up with the answers, right? So I told you last class, think about this situation, right? What if demand goes up, supply also goes up, right? What's going to happen to the price and quantity, right? So, all right. Demand increases, supply also increases, right? What's going to happen to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity? Well, from here, say that's the initial equilibrium. Now new equilibrium is here. So about the quantity, there is absolutely no question, right? Quantity will definitely increase, right? right? Quantity sold will increase. What about the price?
Not sure. Not sure.
Not sure, uncertain, right? Well, this, if I draw the graph like this, right? Then some students may say, oh, the price remains the same, right? Well, that's because I just drew the exactly the same amount of change for demand and supply, right? But whether price will be higher or lower depends on by how much demand curve and supply curve shift, right? So let's say demand curve shifted only slightly, but supply curve increased by a lot, right? Then what's going to happen? Well, first of all, quantity definitely increases. What about the price? Yes, price will actually be lower. Price will actually come down, right? Not only, I mean, using the graph, it's obvious, right? But you should be able to intuitively understand the situation, right? So whatever it is, demand increased a little bit. Well, perhaps that's exactly what the Blu-ray drive situation was, right? I wasn't thinking. So demand for Blu-ray drive increased a little bit, but somehow these manufacturers overestimated the future demand in Blu-ray drive, right? So they invested a lot of money and built the production facility, right? So the supply curve shifted significantly, right? Then, obviously, a lot of the product will be supplied to the market, but there will be not enough demand, right? So the price will be lower. Huh? You can understand, right? Good. So, for all these situations, all these changes, you should be able to figure out what's going to happen to the price and quantity. And here's a summary of outcome. Here's the answer. But don't try to memorize this thing, right? It's going to be incredibly confusing, right? So, just whatever answer you want to come out, you have to just think about the graph, right? What happens if the, demand increases, supply decreases, right? And, you should be able to draw the answer from that. Don't try to memorize this thing, right? I think that's it for this chapter. So next on Thursday, we're going to get into chapter 7. Right? You got the syllabus, right? In the syllabus, there is the course outline, right? And make sure you pay attention to this. According to this, after chapter 3, we're going to chapter 7, right? So, yeah, follow that. I'll see you on Thursday.